The stagecoach rumbled into Denver, Colorado on a bitter morning in March of 1876, carrying a woman whose swollen belly announced her shame to anyone who cared to look, and in the Wild West, everyone looked. Penelope Carter pressed one hand against the dusty window, her heart hammering as she watched the rough wooden buildings come into view through the frost. She had traveled 3 weeks from St. Louis with nothing but a worn carpet bag, $17 sewn into her petticoat, and a baby growing inside her that belonged to a man who had promised her the world before disappearing like smoke. The other passengers had kept their distance during the journey. A married couple from Kansas had moved to the opposite bench after the third day, when Penelope's condition became impossible to ignore, despite her loosest dress and heavy shawl. The whispers followed her like a shadow. Ruined, fallen woman, no better than she ought to be. The words cut deeper than any knife, but Penelope kept her chin up and her eyes forward, because what else could she do? She had no family left in St. Louis, no prospects, and no choice but to start over somewhere new where nobody knew her story. The stagecoach lurched to a stop outside the Wells Fargo office, and Penelope gathered her belongings with trembling hands. The driver, a grizzled man with tobacco-stained teeth, barely looked at her as he helped her down. She stepped into the muddy street, her worn boots sinking slightly into the thawing earth, and tried to get her bearings. Denver was bigger than she had expected, with 2-story buildings lining the main thoroughfare, and the magnificent Rocky Mountains rising in the distance like sentinels guarding the territory. She needed work. She needed shelter. She needed a miracle. The boarding house she found was run by a severe woman named Mrs. Whitmore, who looked Penelope up and down with narrowed eyes when she appeared at the door. "I run a respectable establishment," Mrs. Whitmore said, her arms crossed over her ample bosom. "I can pay," Penelope said quietly, though the words tasted like ash in her mouth. "I need a room for a few weeks while I find work." "Work?" Mrs. Whitmore's eyebrows rose. "In your condition? What kind of work do you think you will find, girl?" Penelope felt heat rise to her cheeks. "I can sew, I can cook, I can clean. I'm willing to do anything honest." Something in her voice must have touched the older woman, because Mrs. Whitmore's expression softened slightly. "I have a small room in the back, $3 a week, meals included. But I will not have any trouble, you understand. No men visitors, no drinking, no carrying on." "There will be no trouble," Penelope promised, and meant it with every fiber of her being. The room was barely larger than a closet, with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a single window that looked out onto an alley. But it was clean and warm, and Penelope sank onto the bed with relief so profound she felt tears prick her eyes. She allowed herself 5 minutes to feel sorry for herself, to remember Thomas and his pretty promises, to mourn the life she had thought she would have. Then she dried her eyes, smoothed her dress, and went downstairs to ask Mrs. Whitmore if she knew anyone who might need help. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of rejection and humiliation. The general store did not need assistance. The hotel had no positions available. The restaurant owner took one look at her belly and shook his head before she could even speak. Penelope felt her small reserve of money dwindling with each passing day, and panic began to claw at her throat during the long, sleepless nights. She was sitting on a bench outside the dry goods store on a cool April morning, trying to decide what to do next, when she heard the commotion. A wagon had broken down in the middle of the street, one wheel completely shattered, and the owner was cursing and kicking at the damaged wood in frustration. Penelope watched as several men stopped to offer advice, but no one seemed willing to actually help move the heavy vehicle out of the way of traffic. Then she saw him. He came striding down the street like something out of a legend, taller than any man she had ever seen, with shoulders so broad they seemed to block out the sun. His hair fell past his collar in dark waves, and a thick beard covered the lower half of his face. He wore buckskin clothing that had clearly seen hard use, and there was a rifle slung across his back. But it was his eyes that caught her attention, even from a distance. They were a startling blue, sharp and assessing as they took in the situation. Without a word, the mountain man walked up to the broken wagon, assessed the damage with a single glance, and then simply lifted the entire back end off the ground. The gathered crowd gasped. Penelope felt her mouth fall open. The wagon had to weigh several hundred pounds, but the man held it steady while 2 others scrambled to drag it to the side of the road. Only when the street was clear did he lower it back down, dust his hands on his pants, and continue on his way as if he had done nothing more remarkable than pick up a penny. "That is Connor Xerxes," a woman said beside her. Penelope turned to see an older lady with kind eyes and graying hair. "He comes down from the mountains once a month or so for supplies. Keeps to himself mostly, but he is a good man. Saved my husband from a bear attack 2 years ago." "He is very strong," Penelope said faintly, still staring after the mountain man. "That he is. Lives up in the high country, traps and hunts. Some say he was running from something back east, but I do not hold with gossip." The woman patted Penelope's hand. "You are the girl staying at Mrs. Whitmore's place, are you not? Having a hard time finding work?" Penelope nodded, trying to keep the despair from her face. "Well, I might know someone who needs help. The Johnsons who run the laundry are getting on in years, and Mrs. Johnson hurt her back last month. They have been struggling to keep up with all the orders. It is hard work, mind you, but they are good people. Want me to introduce you?" "Yes," Penelope said, feeling hope flare in her chest for the first time in weeks. "Yes, please, I would be so grateful." The laundry job saved her life. Mr. and Mrs. Johnson were indeed good people, and though the work was backbreaking, hauling heavy wet linens and standing over steaming washtubs for hours, they treated Penelope with kindness and paid her fairly. They asked no questions about her past or her condition, and Mrs. Johnson even slipped her extra food when she thought Penelope was not looking. As April turned to May and the mountain wildflowers began to bloom, Penelope settled into a routine. She worked 6 days a week, attended church on Sundays despite the disapproving looks from some of the congregation, and saved every penny she could. Her belly grew larger, and she felt the baby moving inside her, little flutters at first and then stronger kicks that made her catch her breath. She tried not to think too much about what would happen when the child was born, how she would manage, whether she could give her baby the life it deserved. She saw Connor Xerxes twice more during those weeks. Once he was loading supplies onto a pack mule outside the general store, moving with an efficiency that spoke of long practice. The second time, she nearly walked right into him as she turned a corner and found herself staring up into those remarkable blue eyes from a distance of barely 2 feet. "Pardon me, miss," he said, his voice a deep rumble that seemed to vibrate in her chest. He stepped aside to let her pass, but his gaze lingered on her face for a moment, and Penelope felt her cheeks warm. "Thank you," she managed, and hurried past before she could make a fool of herself. That night, she dreamed of strong arms and safety, and woke feeling more alone than ever. The trouble started on a Tuesday in late May when Marcus Finch arrived in Denver. Penelope was walking back to the boarding house after work, tired and aching, when a man stepped out of the saloon directly into her path. He was tall and well-dressed, with slicked-back hair and a smile that did not reach his eyes. "Well, well," he said, looking her up and down with an expression that made her skin crawl. "Looks like someone has been a naughty girl." Penelope tried to step around him, but he moved to block her. "Excuse me," she said firmly, keeping her voice steady despite the fear curling in her stomach. "How much for an hour of your time, sweetheart? I'm guessing you cannot be too particular in your current state." The insult hit her like a physical blow. "I am not that kind of woman," she said, her voice shaking now. "Please let me pass." "All women are that kind of woman for the right price," Marcus said, reaching out to grab her arm. "The lady asked you to let her pass." The voice came from behind Penelope, and she spun around to see Connor Xerxes standing there, his massive frame tense and his eyes cold as winter ice. He must have come around the corner without her hearing. Marcus Finch looked up at the mountain man and paled visibly. "I did not mean any offense, just having a bit of fun." "Find your fun elsewhere," Connor said quietly, but there was steel beneath the words. "Now." Marcus held up his hands and backed away, disappearing into the saloon with one last venomous look at Penelope. She stood frozen, her heart pounding, until Connor stepped closer and gently touched her elbow. "Are you all right, miss?" His eyes were concerned now, searching her face. "Did he hurt you?" "No," Penelope whispered. "No, I'm fine. Thank you so much." "A woman should not have to walk these streets alone after dark," Connor said, frowning. "Where are you headed?" "Mrs. Whitmore's boarding house. It is just 3 blocks. I will walk you there." Penelope wanted to protest, to say she could manage on her own, but the truth was she felt shaken and afraid. "That is very kind of you." They walked in silence for a moment, Connor shortening his long strides to match her slower pace. Penelope was acutely aware of his presence beside her, the sheer size and strength of him, the way other people on the street gave them a wide berth. She should have felt intimidated, but instead she felt protected. "I have seen you around town," Connor said after a moment. "You are working at the laundry?" "Yes, the Johnsons have been very good to me." "They are decent folks." He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was gentler. "Denver can be a hard place for a woman alone. Do you have family here?" "No," Penelope said quietly. "No family anywhere, really. My parents died of fever 2 years ago, and I have no siblings. I came here to start fresh." She did not know why she was telling him this. Perhaps because he had saved her, or perhaps because there was something in his steady, calm presence that made her feel like she could be honest. They had reached the boarding house, and Penelope turned to face him on the porch steps. "Thank you again, Mr. Xerxes. I truly appreciate your help." His eyebrows rose. "You know my name? Someone pointed you out to me once. I am Penelope Carter." "Miss Carter." He touched the brim of his hat. "If that man bothers you again, you tell me. I am in town until Friday, staying at the livery stable." "I will, thank you." She watched him walk away, his long strides eating up the distance, and felt something shift in her chest that she could not quite name. The next morning, Mrs. Whitmore cornered Penelope at breakfast. "I saw that mountain man walking you home last night," she said, her eyes sharp. "You want to be careful there, girl. A man like that does not spend time with a woman unless he wants something." "He was just being kind," Penelope said, keeping her voice even. "A man accosted me on the street and Mr. Xerxes intervened." Mrs. Whitmore did not sound convinced. "Well, you remember what I said about no men visitors. That includes mountain men, no matter how heroic they might seem." Penelope nodded and finished her meal in silence, but Mrs. Whitmore's words rankled. Why did everyone assume the worst? Why could a man not simply help a woman without ulterior motives? She carried that frustration with her to work, scrubbing linens with more force than necessary, until Mrs. Johnson gently suggested she take a break before she wore a hole in the fabric. She was hanging sheets to dry in the afternoon sun when Connor appeared in the doorway of the laundry. He looked out of place among the soap and steam, his rough outdoor clothing and imposing size at odds with the domestic setting. Mrs. Johnson bustled over immediately, wiping her hands on her apron. "Mr. Xerxes, what brings you here?" "I was hoping to speak with Miss Carter for a moment, if she can be spared." Mrs. Johnson glanced at Penelope with raised eyebrows, but nodded. "Of course. Penelope, dear, why do not you take your afternoon break now?" Penelope set down the wet sheet she had been holding and walked over to Connor, her heart beating faster. "Is something wrong?" "No, nothing wrong. I just wanted to check on you, make sure that man did not come around again." "I have not seen him," Penelope said, "but thank you for your concern." Connor shifted his weight, looking uncharacteristically uncomfortable. "Miss Carter, I'm heading back up to my cabin tomorrow, but I will be down again in 3 weeks or so. I was wondering if you might allow me to call on you when I return. Properly, I mean, with your permission." Penelope stared at him, certain she must have misheard. "You want to call on me?" "If that would be acceptable to you." "Mr. Xerxes, I'm not sure you understand my situation." She placed a hand on her rounded belly, making it explicit. "I'm carrying another man's child. I was never married. In the eyes of this town, I am ruined." Connor's blue eyes held hers steadily. "I know your situation, Miss Carter. I'm not blind. But I do not care about what this town thinks or what happened before. I only care about who you are now." Penelope felt her throat tighten with emotion. No one had spoken to her with such simple acceptance since she arrived in Denver. "Why?" she whispered. "Why would you want to court someone like me?" "Because I have seen how hard you work. Because you hold your head high even when people whisper behind their hands. Because when that fool insulted you last night, you did not cry or make a scene. You just asked him politely to let you pass. That takes strength." He paused, and a small smile tugged at his mouth beneath his beard. "And because when you look at me, you do not seem afraid, even though most folks cross the street when they see me coming." "You do not frighten me," Penelope said honestly. "You make me feel safe." "Then may I call on you when I return?" Yes, she said, barely able to believe she was agreeing. Yes, you may. His smile widened, transforming his rugged face. Good. That is good. I will see you in 3 weeks, Miss Carter. He left, and Penelope stood there in the doorway, her hand pressed to her chest where her heart was racing like a wild thing. Mrs. Johnson appeared at her elbow, a knowing smile on her face. That's quite a man there, dear. He asked if he could court me, Penelope said, still dazed. Mrs. Johnson? Did you hear what he said? He does not care about the baby or what people think. Connor Xerxes is his own man, always has been. If he says he does not care, then he does not care. Mrs. Johnson squeezed her arm. Give him a chance, Penelope. You deserve some happiness. The next 3 weeks crawled by like molasses in winter. Penelope found herself thinking about Connor at odd moments, remembering the steadiness in his blue eyes, the gentleness in his deep voice when he spoke to her. She told herself not to hope too much, that he might change his mind once he had time to think about what he was taking on, but hope bloomed in her chest anyway, like the wild roses that covered the hillsides around Denver. Her belly grew larger, and she felt the baby moving constantly now, little feet kicking against her ribs. She talked to the child sometimes when she was alone, promising that everything would be all right, that they would figure things out together. She tried not to think about the birth itself, which terrified her, or about how she would care for an infant while working long hours at the laundry. Connor returned to Denver on a sunny morning in mid-June, riding down from the mountains with 2 pack mules loaded with furs and goods for trading. Penelope was hanging laundry when Mrs. Johnson came, hurrying out to tell her she had a visitor. She wiped her damp hands on her apron and walked around to the front of the building, her stomach fluttering with nerves. Connor was waiting by the water trough, and his face lit up when he saw her. Miss Carter, I hope I am not interrupting your work. Not at all. It is good to see you, Mr. Xerxes. Connor, he said, please just call me Connor. Then you must call me Penelope. They smiled at each other like fools, and Penelope felt warmth spread through her entire body. Did you have a good few weeks in the mountains? She asked. Productive enough. Brought down a good load of pelts for trading, but I'm glad to be back in town. His eyes held hers meaningfully. I was wondering if you might let me take you to supper tomorrow evening, if that would be proper. There's a decent restaurant on 3rd Street that serves a good roast. I would like that very much. I will call for you at 6 if that suits. It suits perfectly. They stood there for another moment, neither quite wanting to end the conversation, until Mrs. Johnson called from inside that there was another load ready for washing. Penelope excused herself reluctantly and worked the rest of the day with a smile she could not suppress. The supper date was everything Penelope could have hoped for. Connor was a gentleman, holding doors for her and pulling out her chair, but he was also easy to talk to, with a dry sense of humor that made her laugh. He told her about his life in the mountains, about the cabin he had built with his own hands 5 years ago, about the wildlife and the changing seasons and the profound peace of the high country. Why did you leave civilization behind? Penelope asked, genuinely curious. Connor was quiet for a moment, his expression growing distant. I was in the war, he said finally. Fought for the Union. Saw things no man should see, did things I'm not proud of. When it was over, I tried to go back to my family's farm in Ohio, but I could not settle. Too many ghosts, too much noise in my head. I headed west looking for space to breathe, and I found it in the mountains. Penelope reached across the table and touched his hand gently. I'm sorry you went through that. It was a long time ago. I'm better now, mostly. The mountains healed me. He turned his hand over and clasped her fingers, his grip warm and strong. What about you? What brought you west? Penelope took a breath and told him the truth, all of it. About Thomas, the young lawyer who had courted her so sweetly in St. Louis, about his promises of marriage, his insistence that they express their love fully before the wedding, about how she had given in, had believed him, had loved him with her whole naive heart, about waking one morning to find him gone, along with the small inheritance her parents had left her, about the pregnancy, the shame, the desperate need to escape before her condition became public knowledge. Connor listened without interrupting, his face grave. When she finished, he squeezed her hand. That man was a fool and a coward. You deserve better. I was stupid to trust him. You were in love. That is not stupid. It is human. Connor's voice was firm. And none of what happened was your fault, Penelope. You understand that, right? He took advantage of your trust. The shame is his, not yours." Penelope felt tears prick her eyes. No one had said that to her before. Everyone else had made it clear that she was the one at fault, the fallen woman, the one who should have known better. "Thank you," she whispered. "I meant what I said before," Connor continued. "I do not care about your past. I only care about your future and whether you might let me be a part of it." "The baby will be here in 2 months," Penelope said softly. "You really want to take on another man's child?" Connor did not hesitate. "If you will let me, I will be this child's father, not the man who abandoned you both, but me. I will raise him or her as my own, love them as my own. I swear that to you, Penelope." She started crying then, quiet tears that rolled down her cheeks, and Connor came around the table to kneel beside her chair, his large hands gentle as he wiped the tears away with his thumbs. "I know it is too soon to speak of such permanent things," he said quietly. "We are still getting to know each other, but I wanted you to understand my intentions so there is no doubt in your mind. I am courting you with the hope of making you my wife, and if you say yes, that child becomes mine in every way that matters." "Why?" Penelope asked again, searching his face. "Why would you do this for me? For us?" "Because when I look at you, I see strength and courage and kindness, because you make me want to come down from the mountains instead of hiding from the world, because I'm tired of being alone, and I think maybe you are too." He smiled slightly. "And because my heart decided you were mine about 5 seconds after I saw you sitting on that bench outside the dry goods store, looking so brave and so lost at the same time." Penelope laughed through her tears. "That is not very practical reasoning." "Love never is." The word hung in the air between them, huge and terrifying and wonderful. "Connor, I cannot ask you to love me. Not yet. You barely know me." "I know enough," he said simply. "But I will give you all the time you need to catch up. I am a patient man." They courted through the hot summer months, and Penelope felt herself falling more in love with Connor every day. He came to Denver every week now instead of every few weeks, making the long journey down from the mountains just to spend a few hours with her. They took walks along Cherry Creek, attended church socials together, sat on the porch of the boarding house in the evening, talking until Mrs. Whitmore had to remind them about proper hours. Connor was unfailingly gentle with her, taking her arm when the ground was uneven, carrying her packages from the general store, sitting with her when her back ached and her feet swelled and she felt ungainly and unattractive. He made her feel beautiful despite her huge belly and her worn dresses. He read to her from books he brought down from his cabin, his deep voice soothing in the twilight. He talked to her baby, his big hands spread across her stomach, telling the child about the mountains and the elk herds and the clear streams full of trout. The town gossips had a field day, of course. A pregnant, unwed woman being courted by a rough mountain man was scandalous enough to fuel months of whispered conversations. But Connor faced down anyone who dared say something unkind in his presence, and his fierce protectiveness soon made most people think twice before speaking ill of Penelope, where he might hear. Marcus Finch, the man who had accosted Penelope that first night, made the mistake of calling her a crude name in the saloon one evening. Connor picked him up by his shirt front, carried him outside, and dumped him face first in the horse trough. Marcus left town the next day and did not return. In late July, Connor asked Penelope to marry him. They were sitting by the creek, watching the water flow past in the golden evening light, when he took her hand and cleared his throat nervously. "I know the baby is coming soon," he said, "and I know you probably want to wait until after, until you are recovered and feeling more yourself. But Penelope, I want to marry you before the child is born. I want that baby to come into this world with my name, with the protection of being my legitimate son or daughter. I do not want there to be any question, any doubt in anyone's mind that this child is mine and under my care." Penelope felt her heart swell until it seemed too big for her chest. "Connor, are you sure? Once we are married, there is no going back. You will be tied to me and this baby forever." "That's exactly what I want," Connor said seriously, "to be tied to you forever. I love you, Penelope. I have loved you since that first conversation, and I will love you until the day I die. Marry me. Please." "Yes," Penelope whispered, and then louder. Yes, Connor, I love you too. I will marry you. He kissed her then, soft and sweet and full of promise, and Penelope wrapped her arms around his neck and kissed him back, with all the love and gratitude and hope in her heart. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Connor rested his forehead against hers and smiled. I'm going to make you so happy, he promised. You and the baby both. I swear it. They were married a week later in a simple ceremony at the church, with Mr. and Mrs. Johnson standing as witnesses. Penelope wore a new dress that Mrs. Johnson had helped her sew, pale blue cotton with white lace at the collar and cuffs. Connor wore clean buckskin pants and a shirt he had obviously bought new for the occasion, and his hair was neatly combed back. He looked terrified and thrilled in equal measure as he stood at the altar waiting for her. The Reverend kept the ceremony short, which was a mercy since Penelope could not stand for very long without her back aching. When Connor slipped a simple gold band onto her finger, Penelope felt tears of joy stream down her face. She was married, she had a husband, her child would have a father. You may kiss your bride, the Reverend said with a smile, and Connor cupped her face in his big, calloused hands and kissed her with such tenderness that Penelope thought her heart might burst. They spent their wedding night at the hotel, in the nicest room they had, with a real bed and clean sheets and a window overlooking the mountains. Connor was nervous, worried about hurting her in her delicate condition, but Penelope assured him that it was safe, that she wanted this, wanted to be truly his wife in every sense. He undressed her slowly, reverently, his eyes full of wonder as he looked at her rounded body. You are so beautiful, he murmured, tracing the curve of her belly with his fingertips. So incredibly beautiful. I am fat as a cow, Penelope said, but she was smiling. You are perfect. Connor kissed her stomach, then her breasts, then her mouth, long and deep. My wife, my Penelope. They made love slowly and carefully, Connor holding most of his weight on his arms so he would not press on her belly, his movements gentle and controlled. Penelope clung to his broad shoulders, overwhelmed by the physical sensation and the emotional intensity of being with a man who truly loved her, who had chosen her and her child without reservation. When it was over, they lay tangled together, Connor's hand resting protectively over their baby. I felt that, he said suddenly, his eyes wide. The baby kicked my hand. He or she has been very active lately, Penelope said with a laugh. I think the baby knows something important has happened. Everything has happened, Connor said seriously. We are a family now. You, me, and this little one. A real family. Penelope kissed him, pouring all her love and gratitude into it, and whispered against his lips, Yes, we are. The next few weeks were spent preparing for the baby's arrival. Connor found them a small house to rent on the edge of town, a modest 2-room cabin with a stone fireplace and a little garden plot. It was nothing fancy, but it was clean and sturdy, and most importantly, it was theirs. Connor spent his days making improvements, building a cradle from smooth pine wood, installing shutters on the windows, chopping enough firewood to last through the winter. Penelope nested, washing and mending the baby clothes that Mrs. Johnson and some of the other church ladies had donated, sewing tiny quilts, arranging and rearranging the cradle a dozen times until Connor gently suggested that maybe the baby would not care which corner of the room it was in. She laughed at herself, but she could not help it. After so many months of uncertainty and fear, she finally felt hopeful about the future. The pains started on a hot August morning, 3 weeks before Penelope had expected them. She was making breakfast when the first contraction gripped her, strong enough to make her gasp and grab the edge of the table. Connor was at her side instantly, his face pale. Is it time? I think so. Penelope tried to smile reassuringly. The pains are still far apart. We have time. Connor did not look convinced, but he helped her to the bed and then went racing through town to fetch the midwife, a capable woman named Mrs. Patterson who had delivered half the babies in Denver. She arrived within 20 minutes, took one look at Penelope, and started organizing the room with brisk efficiency. First babies usually take their time, she told Connor, who was hovering anxiously in the doorway. Could be hours yet. You might want to make yourself useful and boil some water, fetch clean towels, that sort of thing. Connor looked like he wanted to argue, but Penelope nodded at him. I will be fine, she said, though another contraction was building and she had to concentrate on breathing through it. The labor lasted 14 hours, 14 long, painful hours during which Penelope was absolutely certain she was going to die, that the baby was never going to come, that this was her punishment for her sins. Mrs. Patterson stayed calm throughout, coaching her on when to push and when to rest, while Connor held her hand and wiped the sweat from her forehead and told her over and over how strong she was, how proud he was, how much he loved her. Finally, as the sun was setting and painting the sky orange and gold, the baby came. One last enormous push, a moment of searing pain, and then the thin, indignant wail of a newborn filled the room. "It is a boy," Mrs. Patterson announced, wrapping the baby in a clean blanket. A big, healthy boy. She placed the baby in Penelope's arms, and Penelope looked down at her son through a haze of exhaustion and wonder. He was red-faced and wrinkled, with a shock of dark hair and tiny, perfect fingers that waved in the air. He was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. "Hello, little one," she whispered. "Hello, my sweet baby boy." Connor leaned over them, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "He is perfect," he said hoarsely. "Absolutely perfect." "Would you like to hold your son?" Penelope asked and carefully transferred the baby into Connor's large arms. Connor cradled the tiny infant with exquisite gentleness, looking down at him with an expression of complete awe. "Hello, son," he said softly. "I am your papa. I'm going to take care of you and your mama forever. That is a promise." The baby stopped crying at the sound of Connor's deep voice, his unfocused eyes seeming to search for the source of the sound. Connor laughed, a sound of pure joy, and kissed the baby's forehead. "What should we name him?" Penelope asked. Connor thought for a moment. "What about Matthew? It means gift of God, and that is what he is, a gift." "Matthew Xerxes," Penelope said, testing it out. "Yes, that is perfect." Mrs. Patterson finished her work and left them alone, promising to check in the next day. Connor laid baby Matthew in the cradle beside the bed, and then climbed carefully onto the mattress next to Penelope, gathering her into his arms. Thank you," he whispered into her hair. "Thank you for giving me this, for trusting me, for letting me be his father." "Thank you for choosing us," Penelope whispered back, "for loving us when no one else would." "Always," Connor promised. "I will always choose you, both of you." They fell asleep like that, wrapped around each other, while their son slept peacefully in his cradle, and the mountains stood guard in the distance. The next few months were a blur of sleepless nights and endless feedings, and the intense, overwhelming love that came with caring for a newborn. Matthew was a good baby, but he still woke every few hours to eat, and Penelope was constantly exhausted. Connor helped as much as he could, walking the floor with Matthew when he was fussy, changing his soiled cloths, singing to him in his deep, rumbling voice. Connor had taken a job at the lumber mill in Denver for the winter, unwilling to leave Penelope and Matthew alone while he trapped in the mountains. The work was hard and the pay was modest, but it was steady, and it meant he was home every night. He would come through the door covered in sawdust, his muscles aching from a day of heavy labor, and his whole face would light up at the sight of his wife and son. "How are my two favorite people?" he would ask, scooping Matthew up for a kiss before pulling Penelope into his arms. "Better now that you are home," Penelope always replied, and meant it with her whole heart. As Matthew grew, he became more interactive, smiling and cooing and eventually laughing, a sound that never failed to make both his parents smile like fools. He was a happy baby, content to be held and cuddled, and he seemed to recognize Connor's voice even when he could not see him, turning his head toward the sound. One evening in November, when Matthew was 3 months old and starting to reach for things with his chubby little hands, Connor came home from work looking thoughtful. He played with Matthew while Penelope finished making supper, but she could tell he had something on his mind. "What is it?" she finally asked as they were eating. "You have been quiet all evening." Connor set down his fork and took her hand. "I've been thinking about next spring," he said. "About going back to trapping in the mountains. It is how I make my best money, and we need to start building up our savings if we want to eventually get our own piece of land, maybe raise some cattle." "All right," Penelope said slowly, not sure where this was going. "But I do not want to leave you and Matthew here in town for months at a time. I do not want to miss watching him grow up, so I was thinking, what if you both came with me?" Penelope blinked. To the mountains? To my cabin. It is remote, yes, and the life is hard, but it is beautiful up there, Penelope. Clean air, clear water, peace and quiet. We would be together as a family. And the cabin is solid, plenty big enough for the three of us. I would teach you how to shoot, how to preserve meat, how to handle the wilderness. What do you think? Penelope thought about it, turning the idea over in her mind. She had lived in cities her whole life, first St. Louis and now Denver. The thought of being isolated in the mountains was daunting, but the thought of being separated from Connor for months was worse. Would it be safe? She asked. With Matthew? I would never put either of you in danger, Connor said seriously. There are risks, yes, but no more than in town. Maybe less in some ways. No disease outbreaks, no drunks causing trouble on Saturday nights, just us in the mountain. Then yes, Penelope decided. Let us do it. Let us go to the mountains together. Connor's face split into a huge grin. Really? You mean it? I mean it. I married you for better or worse, remember? If your life is in the mountains, then that is where we should be. Connor pulled her out of her chair and into his lap, kissing her soundly. You are incredible. Do you know that? The most amazing woman I have ever met. Penelope laughed and kissed him back, and from his cradle, Matthew made a happy gurgling sound, as if giving his approval to the plan. They spent the winter preparing for the move. Connor taught Penelope how to shoot his spare rifle, and she turned out to have a decent eye, hitting the targets he set up more often than not. He showed her how to cure meat, how to render fat for candles, how to identify edible plants. Penelope absorbed it all like a sponge, determined to be useful and capable in their new life. In April, when Matthew was 8 months old and starting to crawl, they loaded up Connor's pack mules and made the journey into the high country. It took 3 days of steady travel, following narrow trails that climbed steadily higher until the air grew thin and cold and the evergreen forests closed around them like a green cathedral. Connor's cabin sat in a small meadow beside a crystal-clear stream, with the peaks of the Rocky Mountains rising on all sides. It was beautiful in a way that made Penelope's throat tighten. The cabin itself was well built, with a stone fireplace, real glass windows, and a sleeping loft. There was even a small barn for the mules and any other animals they might acquire. It is perfect, Penelope breathed, turning in a slow circle to take it all in. Connor, it is absolutely perfect. Welcome home, Connor said, putting his arm around her waist and pulling her close. The first few weeks were an adjustment. The work was constant and physically demanding. Penelope had to learn how to cook on an open hearth, how to manage their limited supplies, how to cope with the isolation. There were no neighbors, no church socials, no familiar faces except Connor and Matthew. At first, the silence felt oppressive, but gradually, Penelope began to appreciate the peace. She loved waking to the sound of birdsong instead of wagon wheels and shouting. She loved the way the morning mist clung to the meadow, the way the stream sang as it rushed over its rocky bed, the way Connor would come in from checking his trap lines and sweep her into his arms for a long kiss. She loved watching Matthew explore the cabin on his hands and knees, pulling himself up on furniture, laughing at everything with baby joy. Connor was a patient teacher, showing her how to skin and butcher the animals he caught, how to stretch and cure the pelts properly, how to read the signs of changing weather. Penelope was a quick study, and within a month she was handling most of the domestic work confidently. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire while Matthew played on a blanket, and Connor would tell her stories of his years in the mountains, of close calls with bears and mountain lions, of brutal winters when he had barely survived. Penelope would tell him about her childhood in St. Louis, about her parents and her dreams before everything fell apart. Do you ever regret it? Connor asked one night. Choosing this life? It is a far cry from what you might have had in the city. Penelope looked at him, at his strong, handsome face painted gold by the firelight, and shook her head. Not for a single moment. This life, with you and Matthew, is more than I ever dreamed I could have. I am happy, Connor. Truly, deeply happy. He pulled her into his arms and kissed her tenderly. Good. That is all I have ever wanted, to make you happy. Summer in the high country was glorious. Wildflowers covered the meadow in a riot of color, and the days were long and warm. Matthew took his first steps in June, tottering across the cabin floor into Connor's waiting arms. Penelope cried happy tears at the milestone, and Connor picked up his son and swung him around, both of them laughing. "That's my boy," Connor crowed, "going to be running around causing trouble in no time." Matthew babbled something that might have been "Papa," and tugged on Connor's beard, making him laugh harder. They fell into a comfortable routine. Connor would leave before dawn to check his trap lines, returning by midday with whatever he had caught. Penelope would help him process the animals, then cook their meals and tend the garden she had planted beside the cabin. Matthew was into everything now that he could walk, and they had to constantly watch to make sure he did not wander too close to the stream or grab something dangerous. In August, Connor came back from checking his traps looking troubled. "There's a big grizzly moving through the area," he told Penelope. "I found tracks down by the North Creek, and he's been raiding my trap lines. I need you to stay close to the cabin until I can track him down, all right? And keep your rifle loaded and nearby." Penelope felt a thrill of fear, but nodded. "We will be careful. You be careful too." "Always am." Connor kissed her and Matthew, then set off with his rifle and his tracking gear. He was gone for 2 days, and Penelope spent that time jumping at every sound, her rifle propped by the door. Matthew sensed her tension and was cranky, crying more than usual. Penelope sang to him and rocked him and tried not to imagine Connor hurt or worse somewhere in the wilderness. When he finally walked into the clearing, tired and dirty but unharmed, Penelope nearly collapsed with relief. "Thank God," she whispered, running to him. "Did you find it?" "Found it and dealt with it," Connor said grimly. "It was an old male, probably pushed out of its territory by a younger bear. It is not a threat anymore." That night, after Matthew was asleep in his small bed, Connor held Penelope close, and she could feel him trembling slightly. "I was so worried about getting back to you," he admitted. "If something had happened to me, you would have been alone up here, hours from help." "But nothing happened," Penelope said firmly. "You are here, we are safe, and that is what matters. Still, I think next summer we should look into getting a dog. A good big one that can help keep watch and give warning if anything dangerous comes around." "I think that is a fine idea." They made love that night with quiet intensity, reaffirming their bond, their need for each other. Afterward, Connor held her against his chest and stroked her hair. "I love you so much," he murmured. "You and Matthew are my whole world." "And you are ours," Penelope whispered back, "always and forever." The years passed in a sweet rhythm of seasons. Winter snows that buried the cabin up to the windows, forcing them to tunnel out just to reach the barn. Spring thaws that turned the meadow into a lake of mud and filled the stream to overflowing. Summer abundance with its endless work and golden days. Autumn glory when the aspen trees turned gold and the air grew crisp. Matthew grew from a toddler into a sturdy little boy, learning to fish in the stream, to ride on Connor's shoulders during their walks through the forest, to help his mother with simple chores. He had Penelope's dark hair and delicate features, but Connor's blue eyes, a quirk of genetics that Connor joked proved Matthew was truly his son now. The boy adored his father with the wholehearted devotion of childhood, following him everywhere and trying to imitate his every move. When Matthew was 3, Penelope discovered she was pregnant again. She told Connor the news on a snowy December evening, watching his face carefully for his reaction. She need not have worried. Connor let out a whoop of joy, picked her up and spun her around despite her laughing protests, then knelt down to press a kiss to her still flat belly. "Another baby," he said wonderingly. "We are going to have another baby." "Are you happy?" Penelope asked, though his reaction had made it obvious. "Happy? I'm over the moon. Matthew is going to be a big brother." Connor pulled her down onto his lap, his arms wrapped securely around her. "Are you happy? How are you feeling?" "Tired and a little queasy, but yes, I'm very happy. This baby was made in love, Connor, in our marriage. That makes it even more special." Connor kissed her softly. "Matthew is just as much mine as this new baby will be. You know that, right? There is no difference in my heart." "I know," Penelope said, tears of happiness stinging her eyes. "You have been a perfect father to him. I could never doubt that." The pregnancy progressed smoothly, Despite the challenges of living in the remote mountain cabin, Connor was even more protective than he had been during her first pregnancy, barely letting her lift anything heavy, insisting she rest whenever possible. Matthew, sensing something was different, became gentler with his mother, patting her belly and talking to his baby sibling in his high, sweet voice. In July of 1881, their daughter was born. The labor was faster this time, only 6 hours, and when Mrs. Patterson, who had made the long journey up to the cabin a week before the due date, placed the squalling infant in Penelope's arms, she felt her heart expand with love. "What should we name her?" Connor asked, gazing at his daughter with undisguised adoration. "What about Rose?" Penelope suggested. "She is as beautiful as the wild roses that bloom in our meadow." "Rose Xerxes," Connor said, testing the name. "I love it. Hello, little Rose. Welcome to the family." Matthew was fascinated by his baby sister, wanting to hold her constantly and bringing her his favorite toys. Connor built a bigger bed frame so the whole family could sleep together, and many mornings Penelope would wake to find Matthew curled up between her and Connor, with Rose sleeping peacefully in her father's protective arms. Life in the mountains had its hardships. Winters were brutally cold, and they sometimes went weeks without seeing another human soul. Supplies had to be carefully rationed, and there were times when game was scarce and their meals were sparse. But there was joy, too. So much joy. The sound of their children's laughter echoing through the meadow, Connor teaching Matthew to shoot his first rabbit, Rose taking her first steps right into her mother's arms, family dinners by the fire with everyone talking over each other. When Matthew was 6 and Rose was 3, Connor and Penelope decided to build a larger cabin. The original one was getting cramped with 4 people and all their supplies. They spent the summer and fall working on it together, with Matthew helping by carrying small tools, and Rose playing nearby with her rag doll. The new cabin had 2 sleeping rooms, a proper kitchen area, and a large main room with a stone fireplace big enough to heat the whole space. Connor built shelves and a real table with chairs. Penelope sewed curtains for the windows and braided rugs for the floors. By the time the first snows came, they were settled into their new home, and it felt like a palace compared to what they had before. That winter, Connor taught Matthew to read using an old Bible and some primers they had brought from Denver. The boy proved to be bright and eager to learn, and soon he was reading everything he could get his hands on. Rose was too young yet, but she loved when Matthew would read to her, stumbling over the bigger words but persisting until he got through the whole story. Penelope sometimes thought about the life she had left behind, about the shame and fear she had felt arriving in Denver, pregnant and alone. It seemed like a lifetime ago, like something that had happened to a different person. That frightened girl could never have imagined this, a life of such fullness and love. She had a husband who cherished her, children who were healthy and happy, a home that was truly hers. On their 5th wedding anniversary, Connor surprised her by producing a small box wrapped in cloth. Inside was a delicate silver locket that must have cost him dearly. "Open it," he urged, watching her face eagerly. Penelope opened the locket and found 2 tiny pictures inside. One was of Matthew, and the other was of Rose, both clearly drawn by Connor's own hand. They were not professional quality, but they were recognizable and clearly done with great care. "Connor, this is beautiful," Penelope breathed. "You made this?" "Drew the pictures myself. Took me weeks to get them right, and I traded a whole season's worth of beaver pelts for the locket. But I wanted you to have something special, something to remind you how much I love you and our family." Penelope threw her arms around him, the locket clutched in her hand. "I love it. I love you. Thank you, my darling husband." That night, after the children were asleep, they made love with the passionate tenderness of 2 people who knew how lucky they were to have found each other. Afterward, Connor traced patterns on Penelope's bare shoulder and spoke softly. "Do you ever wish things had been different? That you had married someone respectable in St. Louis, had an easier life?" Penelope turned to look at him, her expression serious. "Never, not once. Thomas did me a favor by leaving, though I did not know it at the time. If he had stayed, I would have married him, and I would have been miserable. He was not a good man, Connor. You are. You're the best man I have ever known. I am just a rough mountain man with no education and no prospects beyond what I can trap and hunt. You are my husband, and the father of my children. You are the man who chose me when I was ruined and desperate. You are the man who keeps me safe, who makes me laugh, who loves me even when I am tired and cranky and have not washed my hair in a week." Penelope cupped his bearded face in her hands. "You are everything to me, Connor Xerxes. Everything." Connor kissed her then, deep and sweet, and whispered against her lips, "And you are my whole world. Penelope, you and our babies. I would not trade this life for anything." As the years rolled on, their family continued to grow and thrive. Matthew became a capable young hunter and trapper, working alongside his father and learning everything Connor could teach him. Rose proved to have her mother's cleverness and her father's determination, and by the age of 5 she could already shoot a rifle and ride a horse bareback. When Rose was 6 and Matthew was 9, Penelope discovered she was pregnant for a third time. She was 32 now and worried that she might be too old, but Connor dismissed her concerns with a laugh. "Too old? Woman, you are in your prime, and this baby is going to be just as perfect as the first two." He was right. In the spring of 1884, they welcomed another son, whom they named Samuel after Connor's father. Samuel had his father's dark hair and his mother's warm brown eyes, and he was a happy, contented baby who rarely cried. With 3 children, life became even busier. Penelope spent her days cooking, cleaning, sewing, and teaching the children their lessons. Connor worked from dawn to dusk trapping, hunting, tending to their small herd of goats and chickens, and making improvements to their property. But despite the exhaustion, there was deep contentment. They had built something real and lasting, a family bound not just by blood, but by love and choice. On Matthew's 10th birthday, Connor took him aside for a serious talk. Penelope watched from the cabin window as father and son walked down to the stream, Connor's hand on Matthew's shoulder. When they returned an hour later, Matthew's eyes were red-rimmed, but he was smiling. He ran to Penelope and hugged her tightly. "Papa told me," he said quietly, "about my birth father, about how he left you and how Papa chose to be my father instead." Penelope's heart clenched. "Matthew, you have to understand." "I do understand," Matthew interrupted. "I understand that Papa is the only father I have ever needed or wanted. I understand that he loved me before I was even born, and that he has been there for every single day of my life. Blood does not make a father, Mama. Love does." Penelope looked at Connor, who was standing in the doorway with tears streaming down his face. He had obviously told Matthew everything, and Matthew, bless his wise young heart, understood. "Thank you," she whispered to Connor. "Thank you for giving him that gift." "He deserved to know the truth," Connor said hoarsely, "and he deserved to know just how much I love him, how much I have always loved him." Matthew went to Connor and hugged him fiercely. "You are my papa," he said firmly. "You will always be my papa. I love you." "I love you too, son," Connor said, his voice breaking, "more than you will ever know." That night, after the children were all asleep, Penelope and Connor sat by the fire holding hands. "We did it," Penelope said softly. "We built a family, a real family, out of nothing but hope and love." "We did," Connor agreed, "and I would do it all again in a heartbeat." The years continued to pass in the sweet rhythm of mountain life. The children grew taller and stronger. Matthew shot his first elk at 12 and was so proud he nearly burst. Rose learned to cook and sew from her mother, but she preferred being outside with her father and brothers, helping with the trap lines and learning to track game. Samuel was a dreamer, always asking questions about the world beyond their mountain, talking about maybe becoming a doctor or a teacher someday. When the children were older, teenagers now, Connor and Penelope decided to take them down to Denver for a visit. It had been nearly 12 years since Penelope had been in the city, and she was curious to see how much it had changed. Denver had indeed changed, growing from a rough frontier town into a proper city with paved streets, gas lamps, and even some early telephone lines. But the people were the same, and Penelope was surprised by how many remembered her and Connor. Mr. and Mrs. Johnson were retired now, but they welcomed Penelope with tears and hugs. Mrs. Whitmore, now quite elderly, admitted that she had been wrong to judge Penelope so harshly all those years ago. Even the reverend who had married them sought them out to tell them how pleased he was to see their family thriving. You were brave, he told Penelope. Coming here alone the way you did, starting over when most people would have given up. And Connor, you were a good man to stand by her. You have set an example for this whole town. On their last day in Denver, they visited the cemetery where Penelope's parents were buried. She had never been able to afford headstones when she first arrived, but Connor had quietly commissioned them years later, having them placed through contacts in town. Now, Penelope stood before the simple granite markers, her hand in Connor's, and told her parents about their grandchildren, about the life she had built. I wish you could have met them, she whispered. You would have loved Connor, and you would have been so proud of the children. Connor squeezed her hand. I think they know, he said gently. I think they are watching over all of us. They returned to their mountain home with supplies and stories, and life continued in its gentle pattern. The children grew into young adults, strong and capable and kind. Matthew decided to stay on the mountain, building his own cabin a few miles from his parents' place and starting his own trapping business. Rose surprised everyone by falling in love with a young man from a neighboring valley, a farmer's son named James, and married him in a simple ceremony in the meadow. Samuel, true to his dreams, left for Denver at 18 to attend school and pursue a career in medicine. It was hard watching him go, but Penelope and Connor were proud of his ambition and determination. As Connor and Penelope entered their 50s, they slowed down a bit, but they were still strong and healthy. They had grandchildren now, 2 from Rose and James, and 1 from Matthew and his wife Anna. The grandchildren loved visiting the mountain cabin, listening to their grandfather's stories, and learning wilderness skills from their grandmother. On their 25th wedding anniversary, Connor and Penelope took a walk to the spot where he had first proposed to her all those years ago. They sat by the creek, their hair graying now, but their love as strong as ever. Do you remember that first day you saw me? Penelope asked, leaning against Connor's broad shoulder. Sitting on that bench looking lost? I remember thinking you were the most beautiful thing I had ever seen, Connor said. And the saddest, I wanted to make you smile. You did, Penelope said softly. You made me smile, and you made me believe in love again. You gave me a family, Connor. You gave me everything. You gave me more, Connor insisted. You gave me purpose. You made me want to be better, to be worthy of you and the children. You saved me just as much as I saved you. Penelope turned to look at him, this man who had stood by her through everything, who had loved her unconditionally, who had raised another man's child as his own without a moment's hesitation. His face was lined now, his beard streaked with gray, but his blue eyes were as bright and loving as they had been the first time he looked at her. I love you, she said simply. Then, now, always. Always, Connor echoed, and kissed her as the mountain stream sang beside them and the peaks stood eternal against the sky. They lived to see their grandchildren grow, to celebrate 50 years of marriage, to watch their family expand and flourish. Matthew took over more of the trapping business, allowing Connor to slow down and enjoy his golden years. Rose's children visited often, filling the cabin with laughter and noise. Samuel became a respected doctor in Denver and named his first son Connor in honor of the man who had raised him. Connor passed away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 78, with Penelope beside him and their children gathered around. His last words were, I love you all. Take care of each other. Penelope held his hand as he slipped away, her heart breaking, but also grateful for the 54 years they had shared. She lived another 5 years, spending her time with her children and grandchildren, telling them stories of their grandfather and the life they had built together. She made sure they knew the whole story, how she had come to Denver ruined and desperate, and how Connor had looked past all of that to see the woman she truly was. He loved you before you were born, she told her grandchildren, all of you. His love was big enough to encompass anyone who needed it. That is the legacy he left us. When Penelope died at the age of 81, she was buried beside Connor in the meadow overlooking their cabin, with the mountains standing guard above them. Her children and grandchildren gathered to say goodbye, and as they stood in the afternoon sun, Matthew told them all one more time the story of how his parents met, how Connor had chosen to be his father, how love could heal even the deepest wounds. They built something beautiful here, Matthew said, his voice thick with emotion. Not just a home, but a family. They showed us that love is not about blood or circumstance. It is about choice and commitment and showing up every single day. That is what Papa did for all of us. Rose nodded, tears streaming down her face. They taught us that everyone deserves a second chance, that no one is beyond redemption. Mama was labeled ruined, and Papa was a broken soldier. But together, they were whole. Samuel, the doctor from Denver, added his own thoughts. They taught me that being a father is not about biology. It is about being there, about teaching and guiding and loving unconditionally. Papa was my father in every way that mattered, and I strive every day to be the kind of man he was. As the sun set over the Rocky Mountains that evening, turning the sky brilliant shades of orange and pink and gold, the family gathered in the cabin for one final meal together. They told stories and shared memories, laughing and crying in equal measure. And though Connor and Penelope were gone, their love remained, woven into every beam of the cabin they had built, every tree in the forest they had walked, every stone in the meadow where they had lived and loved and raised their family. Their story was one of redemption and second chances, of a man who saw past society's judgment to the woman underneath, of a woman who found the courage to love again after betrayal. It was a story of chosen family, of love that transcended blood, of a promise made and kept faithfully for a lifetime. And in the end, it was a story with a happy ending, which is the best kind of all.